Thanks for joining. We'll start up in around 2 or 3 minutes. So yeah, soon. So thank you for coming wherever you are. I wanted to start off with a few thank yous. So first of all, thank you to LSU Press for organising this event. Also, thanks especially to the press's editor-in-chief, Rand Dotson, and the series editor, Mike Parish, for believing in this project, to the press's many staff for their excellent work in bringing the book to completion. Pleased with the cover and everything else with it. And also thanks to the many archivists, academics, and others who really helped me along the way. Certainly, many people have been really helpful throughout. In terms of the structure of what will happen now, I'll give a talk now about book, and then around about 30 minutes past the hour, we'll have a Q&A. So please, be thinking of your questions. You can put them in the chat as well, I believe. So I'll go into some detail about, in more depth about what the book's about soon, in case you weren't sure. It's about Reconstruction, particularly in central Louisiana. But I wanted to talk first more about like how I came to the project. You probably notice I don't have an American accent, although it's softened a little bit British accent from having a Tennessean wife for the last decade or so. I grew up on the Isle of Man, studied at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, which is where I became really interested in civil rights and Southern US politics, which was the subject of my first book, but in the 20th century. So I came to this book project by accident and a really lucky series of events. When I was finishing up my PhD dissertation, I heard from my supervisor about a postdoctoral opportunity to work with Adam Fairclough on a reconstruction project in the Netherlands. I soon talked with him, defended my PhD a couple of months later, and quickly moved to Leiden in the Netherlands. So I'm a sort of 20th century to 19th century history migrant here. But you can see a through line in my interest, particularly in Southern politics and issues relating to civil rights. And as I worked on this project over the last decade or so, the history of Reconstruction has seemed more and more relevant to me. In terms of highlights of spending time in the Netherlands, I learned some Dutch, so I'm now semi-passable, at least in some situations. So at least for things like ordering food, some food, and coffee. I learned about borrel, which for those who aren't in the know, is a sort of post-work snack meal, which I'd highly recommend. I also benefited greatly while I was there from the generosity of Adam Fairclough and also Mark de Vries when I was in Leiden. As some of you may know, Adam published a book on Reconstruction in Natchitoches, very close to the focus of my own book towards the northwest of Louisiana. He published that a few years back, and then he's wrote another one on the aftermath of the disputed 1876 elections in Louisiana with LSU Press, no less. Meanwhile, Mark de Vries wrote an excellent PhD on violence during Reconstruction in Louisiana's Red River Valley, so from the center of the state up to the northwest. I've been fortunate, although you can use the internet for a lot of things with research now, I've been fortunate to be able to spend some extended periods in the US for research, mostly in Louisiana, but also Washington, DC and Boston. Although since I've worked at a British university for much of the time, I've been researching the book since 2016. The university schedules over here mean that the time I normally get to spend a prolonged period in the United States is July and August. And it does and did take me getting some used to the humidity in Baton Rouge. While in Baton Rouge, where I did a good chunk of the research around the archives at LSU and the state archives, I stayed usually with an archivist and also a cycling fanatic. So I got to know plenty of cycle routes around the city as well, in between archival work, and enjoying good food and good company as well. There were plenty of archival curiosities along the way. I'll just mention two now. So while I'm used to reading letters, printed materials, and so on, came across a lock of hair when researching in the Cami Henry Research Center at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches. And then slightly further south, at LSU Alexandria, their archive, a mouse from presumably many decades ago thwarted my plans to know more about what the white small farmer Frank Bennett thought about Black political activism in Rapides. It always seems the vital part of the letter missing there, or at least enough selective nibbles there. So on to a bit more about what the book's about in detail. This is a book about the history of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and its aftermath in central Louisiana, with a close focus on Rapides Parish. So this is a geographically large, in the 19th century, Black majority parish, with substantial influence on the state's pre- and post-war politics. So actually, the governor immediately preceding the Civil War in office, Thomas More, hailed from Rapides Parish, as did the first post-war governor of the state, James Madison Wells, who was also an unconditional unionist during the Civil War and became a prominent Republican too. My book tackles two main and interrelated questions in research about Reconstruction. So first of all, looking at how Black political power and Black freedoms more broadly unfolded differently in different places. And then second, about the viability of congressional Reconstruction more broadly in Louisiana and the South. So how viable the Congressional Reconstruction Project was. Rapides, so where much of the focus of the book is, not exclusively, but primarily, it was the second largest parish by population in Louisiana in 1860, so just before the Civil War. Although, of course, Orleans Parish, that population was nearly 7 times larger. So it's a large rural parish. In terms of what it looked like, it had sections of really fertile river valley, which was well suited to cotton and sugar production. And then the remainder of the parish was more sparsely populated areas of pine hills and pine flats. It had been a French post and then a Spanish one before being American. In 1860, about 60 or 6 in 10 of the population were enslaved. And then in 1870, it had a slightly smaller, but still clear black majority. And this happened, or this came after the formation of Grant Parish to the north in 1869 from parts of Rapides and other nearby parishes. It's one of the habits during Reconstruction of politicians to create new parishes, in part because you could then have more patronage, give more paying jobs to people who might then support you. So, of course, no case study can claim to be comprehensive, but Central Louisiana and Rapides in particular can tell us much about the trajectory of Black freedoms and Reconstruction in Louisiana and in the rural Deep South more broadly. So Rapides experienced relative calm early in Reconstruction, and then Republican politics proved resilient there during the state's violent white counter-revolution in the 1870s. This stemmed in part from the parish's extended, although often really limited, military occupation, so Union military occupation in the parish. It also, of course, had a black population majority, which helps with returning Republican majorities when the great majority of black voters support the Republican Party. And also the presence of substantial sugar cultivation there. Without going into too much depth on this, this relates to the persistence of patterns of gang labor after slavery, which provides more safety in numbers compared to areas where cotton agriculture dominated and people were more likely to be sharecropping afterwards and more vulnerable to vigilante violence. On sugar and the sugar region, John Rodriguez has written an excellent book on this. Again, incidentally, by LSU Press some years ago, if you are interested. So Rapides stood at Louisiana's cultural and agricultural crossroads. So in terms of Anglo elements and more French and Catholic ones. It was also the northernmost parish with substantial sugar production. An advantage of looking here as well was the pretty good source base. So these include a near complete run of the local Democratic newspaper called the Louisiana Democrat, except for a bit during the Civil War, pretty much from 1865 on, it's really near complete. And you also have some years for a Republican paper, which was, well, the one that survives was called the Rapides Gazette. You also have military records held in Washington, D.C., and congressional testimonies and reports, which one benefit of there being so many disputed elections in Louisiana during Reconstruction is that you get a lot of paper trail about people testifying about it, which is useful for historians. You have Freedmen's Bureau records, a good number of archival collections, although they're mostly from elite white Southerners' perspectives. One challenge with this is that, with the notable exception of congressional testimonies and a few petitions, it is harder to find black voices in the sources, despite African Americans forming the majority of the population in central Louisiana. So one example of this challenge here, there was an African American state senator for Rapides called George Young Kelso, and he owned the Rapides Gazette for a time and briefly edited it as well. But unfortunately, those issues haven't survived. Another challenge of finding Republican newspapers, along with the short print runs, is that Democratic opponents had a habit, certainly in Rapides, and not limited there, to destroying Republican printing presses. Despite the helpfulness of surviving newspapers, though, you can sometimes do historical detective work, and you spot when they're giving you an obviously misleading picture of events as they happen on the ground. So I wanted to give an example here about LSU. Some of you may know that Louisiana State University, now in Baton Rouge, with a major campus in Baton Rouge, it started out as the Louisiana State Seminary. And this was based in Rapides Parish near Pineville. But the seminary burned in 1869. Writing to the seminary's first superintendent, who was William T. Sherman of Union Army fame, David Boyd suggested in 1869 that the fire might have been started in retaliation for the killing of an African American by one of the seminary's cadets the month before. But no mention of this killing or of white residents subsequent breaking the cadet out of jail before facing trial appeared in the local Democratic press. So it does raise questions about quite how faithful a representation of what you're getting from the sources you have. Obviously, always a challenge for historians. Rapides was part of what historian Ted Tunnell termed, quote, the alluvial Y. So this involves, if you think of Louisiana being a sort of reverse J shape, up from the center of the state through to the northwest part, and then along the Mississippi, you've got the Mississippi River and the Red River. And these are, along those rivers, you've got black majority parishes that are essential to providing Republican voting majorities during Reconstruction. Beyond the Red River Valley, other hubs of post-war black political power were along the overwhelmingly black majority parishes bordering the Mississippi from around the center of the state up to the northeast, and then in the southeastern sugar-dominated parishes, where black political power persisted beyond the 1870s. So it's after this compromise of 1877 that brought the end of the state level Republican control in the state in Louisiana. So running from Rapides in the center of the state up to the northwest around Caddo and Bossier, the majority black Red River Valley parishes then became a vital battleground for political control of the state. Northwest Louisiana, where Union troops during the Civil War had never occupied, and cotton was the major cash crop, was notorious for its violent resistance to emancipation and Republican politics after the war. In contrast, Rapides and neighboring Natchitoches Parish didn't experience this mass violence that plagued parishes further, especially to the northwest. But despite this relative stability, the elephant in the room here is that perhaps the era's single bloodiest race massacre took place just north of Rapides Parish at Colfax in April 1873. And this was on land that was actually within Rapides Parish lines until Grant Parish was created in 1869. And many white Rapides Parish residents joined in with the killing there. So this book, in many ways, it tells a success story, but also the central Louisiana experience highlights the limits of possible during Reconstruction in the rural Deep South, and here particularly, of course, and also the tragedy of Reconstruction's ultimate collapse. So on to the big claims I make. I make three sort of overarching arguments in this book. First of all, white allegiances were messy and shifting during the Civil War, Reconstruction, and beyond. Second, although African Americans' advances were incremental, black citizens gained an economic foothold and created a functioning biracial democracy in Rapides that local Democrats couldn't dislodge until they won state-level power again in 1877. And then thirdly, this case in central Louisiana highlights the early successes of this intellectual project of white supremacists, of associating Democrats with manliness, civilization, all this in scare quotes, and quote, the best men, in contrast, associating Republicans with being, quote unquote, bad, dependent, cowardly, unmanly, and more perniciously still, associating Black political power with supposed African-American sexual rapacity. And this is particularly apparent in the aftermath of the Colfax Massacre of 1873. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail now on the messiness of allegiance. So the first overarching argument I make. White central Louisianans had been lukewarm to secession, and despite having initial enthusiasm for the Confederate war effort after Fort Sumter, draft evasion soon became widespread. Alongside this, trading across enemy lines was common during the Civil War, and when faced with Union military incursions into the Red River Valley in 1863 and 1864, in 1864, hundreds of free residents, around over 600 from Rapides Parish, swore oaths of future Union loyalty, in part some to protect property, some for commercial gain, and no doubt many other reasons. But you can get a sense of the sort of spectrum of responses to the war by looking at the Tejada brothers. So the Tejada family was part of the Rapides Parish white elite. And Joe Tejada served in the Confederate Army and remained an ardent Confederate throughout the war. His brother Lewis had been a secessionist delegate at the 1861 secession convention for Louisiana. But then he signed a Union loyalty oath in 1864, before then returning allegiance to the Confederacy. Thomas Tejada signed a Union loyalty oath in 1864 as well, and he was also friends with the local Unionist cavalry scout, Dennis Haynes. And Thomas, after the war, shot his brother, Joe, non-fatally. Joe himself had assaulted Haynes in retaliation for a wartime attack on his property. Then lastly, Theodore Tejada also took the Union oath, but then served in the US Navy, dying in 1865. There were some unconditional white Unionists in the region, but widely held white racial animosities towards African Americans meant that there were few wartime white Unionists or war-weary Confederates who then became open post-war Republicans. But still there remained significant white political fissures, especially along class lines. So this meant that Democrats needed to really cultivate political consensus rather than just being able to assume that they could count on all white voters siding with them during Reconstruction and beyond. Despite the best efforts of the Louisiana Democrat newspaper, which was the local party mouthpiece, despite its best efforts to project white political unity, you could occasionally see evidence of class divisions shining through its coverage. For instance, when it editorialized in 1870 in favor of there being a parish bond issue for railroad construction, despite there being disagreements over the path that the track should actually take in the parish. Similarly, there was a short-lived, militantly white supremacist paper published in the parish called The Caucasian, which was published in Alexandria, the parish seat, in 1874 and 1875. And this newspaper, in its pages, repeatedly addressed, quote, the patriotic voters of the Pine Woods. I think another person, or someone who offers a great window into the messiness of these allegiances and persistent white class tensions is Frank Bennett. So he was a small farmer who was based in the south of Rapides Parish. He was a reluctant conscript into Confederate service in 1862, and he wrote to his wife, Columbia, about class tensions in camp and also about his interest in deserting. After the war, he was arrested in February of 1872 in connection with anti-Black mob violence, which had stemmed from a livestock dispute. But by October that year, he wrote to his wife Columbia that, quote, "The people, both black and white, are going to run me for sheriff, ... on the independent ticket." And then he continued, quote, "The people of the Pinewoods has put me up, and all the working class of the country says I shall be elected." Now, Bennett wasn't successful, and the local press doesn't actually show that he received votes here. But Bennett and the routine appearance of white independent candidates for local offices during Reconstruction was a telltale sign of persistent white political disunity. And Democratic fears of white defections continued even after Democrats regained statewide control in 1877. So in 1878, the Louisiana Democrat leaned heavily on themes of racial unity and manhood to appeal to, quote, "all white men in the pine woods of our parish who have been, who have more or less been disposed, ... to join or affiliate with a new party called the, quote, Working Men's Party." And then the editor continued to claim that these candidates, the working men's candidates, quote, "are aiding to forge new handcuffs to bind you to Negro radical rule once more." I should say, that's from the quotation from the source. I'll use African American and Black when speaking in my own voice here. Then later, populists couldn't carry parish elections in Rapides. There's sort of and vote stealing operation was pretty effective, fraudulent operation in terms of the election machinery in the parish after Reconstruction. But despite this, the parish was a hotbed of agrarian organizing in the late 19th century. In terms of this messiness and fluidity of the period too, Democrats were willing to claim lucrative political office, even under governments that they publicly deemed illegitimate. And white and black politicians, often with transparently financial motivations, occasionally switched party allegiances. So even at the height of the white paramilitary counter-revolution in Louisiana, white conservatives were willing to accept Republican patronage appointments. So an example of this, in 1873, the Louisiana Democrat newspaper had attacked there being the appointment of an African-American postmaster in Alexandria, but then his son and the publisher of the paper, or rather the son of the editor and the paper's publisher, then became deputy postmaster. To a lesser extent, black allegiances were fluid as well. So W.H. Mills, an African-American teacher in a local Freedmen's Bureau school, had also been active in local Republican politics in 1868, but then became a traveling speaker for the Democratic Party later that year, before, by 1871, he had again returned to Republican politics. One case I find particularly interesting for showcasing Black community divisions involved the Black Methodist Episcopal Church pastor, Christopher Hunt, who was free-born, a Barbados native who moved to Rapides Parish in 1873. And there was a feud with the Black Republican state representative, John Mayo. So Hunt threatened to exclude Mayo's wife from the communion, and in response, Mayo denounced Hunt in the street as a, quote, damned thief. And after that, Hunt sued him and received a judgment for $1,000. The trial, though, alongside airing local gossip, revealed local Black class tensions, with one witness claiming that Hunt, quote, looks upon us as an ignorant class of men and not his equals. The local white supremacist press was very much in Hunt's corner and pointed to something or noted something that likely undergirded this dispute, which was that Hunt, unlike his predecessors, had actually kept the church closed to political activities. And this was troubling for Republicans because Hunt wasn't a Democratic stooge. He actually argued forcefully against racial separation in the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1876, but he was no fan of local Republicans. So moving on briefly to the second main argument about Republican control in central Louisiana, I contend that it's precarious, but it doesn't collapse under its own weight. Instead, it does take this long-running, violent counter-revolution to displace Republican office holders and then begin to overturn African Americans' Reconstruction era economic and political gains. And in the case of Rapides, Rapides Parish actually still returns an unchallenged Republican majority in 1876. So despite white paramilitarism being widespread, Republican politics remains strong up until 1877 there. With the loss of statewide power, that's when local Democrats are able to dismantle local Republican political power and chip away at African American freedoms. In terms of economics, African American emancipation did itself seem revolutionary, but for all of these struggles of the formerly enslaved to secure economic independence, with some notable successes, for instance, Peter Francis, almost certainly formerly enslaved, moved from contracting for a share of the crop to leasing, to then owning property outright by 1870, by the 1870 census. Generally, Black economic gains were incremental up to about 1880, and then they stagnated for the rest of the century. And in terms of the elite before the war and after, this remained quite steady. So despite the complaints about rampant taxation and economic woes during the era, really there's more continuity than change in terms of the wealthiest remaining the wealthiest there. There are, though, some examples of Black economic activism alongside these success stories. So one case of this, you get snippets of the Rapides Planters Association, which was a farming cooperative headed by formerly enslaved Republicans, and this operated between 1875 and 78. Now, for all of the local white resistance to racial change, you also get hints of some open interracial socializing in Rapides. So one interesting case here was actually a court case involving a Bavarian immigrant called Frederick Fluck, who had opened a bar that had a predominantly, but not exclusively, Black clientele in 1872. White town residents then petitioned, and the mayor shut it down in September. After that, a district court reopened it, and Fluck sued the mayor and town constable and won some damages before that was later overturned by the state Supreme Court. In the testimony, though, it comes through clearly that a key complaint of opponents of the bar was that it had a mixed clientele, but also that white residents did quite frequently use the bar, especially the area's immigrant population. And even the town's mayor, who had shut the bar down, acknowledged drinking, quote, blackberry brandy there 2 or 3 times. Although in his defense, he claimed he was ill at the time and other drinking establishments were further away. So Fluck's bar was the place for him. Lastly, my third sort of big argument relates to the gendered and sexualized language of democratic political appeals from the 1870s, particularly. So from April 73, with the Colfax Massacre, these appeals to white voters gain a more explicitly sexualized edge, alongside customary denunciations of Republican, quote, misrule. And in this trend, white Louisianans are quite pioneering in popularizing these appeals to militant white manhood. And this helps power the white paramilitary counter-revolution across the region. It also, this stress on sexual themes likely spoke to the desperation of democratic politicians and their failure to achieve their political ends by more traditional appeals. And the allegations here soon filtered into wider critiques of Southern Republicans. I think the Colfax case is particularly interesting for the tall tales, or the very misleading and often, or at times, clearly false accounts that are spun afterwards. So from 1874, Democrats alleged that black men in Colfax had committed rape, among other crimes, in the lead up to the April 1873, what they called, quote, a riot, or the riot there. And then either beforehand or afterwards, black men had raped one or more respectable local white women. And this is a version of events that makes it into the congressional report on Louisiana's disputed 1874 elections, and also into non-Southern newspaper coverage, as in a correspondent piece for the New York Times in October 1874. But the chronology that's being pushed here is clearly false. So conservatives alleged that one or more black on white rapes had occurred in October 1873, when a state militia sought to arrest white paramilitaries, so some 6 months or so after the massacre. And again, white conservatives only alleged that interracial rape had preceded the mass killing once a handful of white paramilitaries faced trial in federal court for the killing in 1874. Now, Reconstruction and these sort of half or misleading tales about Reconstruction, and the memory of the Colfax massacre particularly, is used by Democrats later to intimidate African Americans and promote white political unity well beyond Reconstruction. So for African Americans, Colfax also served as a cautionary tale of like the dangers of really assertive resistance. But white supremacists deploy these memories of Reconstruction and the Colfax massacre particularly to try and promote promote political unity in later years. But these memories aren't still. Instead, like the groups of heroes and villains subtly shifts to meet contemporary demands. So with this, you can see that the outlines of this black male rapist myth, which is really a sort of key underpinning of the segregated South, it's apparent in central Louisiana in the 1870s, even as interracial liaisons obviously persisted. So alongside lost causes, alongside lost cause stories of the Civil War and Reconstruction, this myth formed a key part of subsequent justifications for lynching, disfranchisement, and segregation laws. So to wrap up then, Reconstruction in central Louisiana, I see as at its core a tragic story. So despite strong black political mobilization, the counter-revolutionaries did win. And that's with really negative consequences for most of the region's population. And I am mindful of like the major obstacles blocking a more racially and economic just settlement. But I do argue against a narrative of inevitable failure. So for all of its shortcomings, African Americans and their allies created a functioning democracy in central Louisiana by the early 1870s, where black citizens made incremental economic gains. Some white and black residents drank and socialized alongside each other. Other white residents took up lucrative patronage opportunities, and many others remained uninterested in voting Democratic. With hindsight, the failure of Reconstruction was predictable, but some alternative outcomes were possible, and for a time they prospered. Thank you. Now I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you. Our first question is from Quinn. Question is, how can communities of color in the Deep South, especially South Louisiana, use this historical information to navigate today's current restrictive political and social climate in America?
Thank you. Excellent question. I would say one important part, I think, is that struggles continue. In part, I hope it is not just a negative message of Reconstruction here. I think there are opportunities and there are like alternative outcomes, even if in hindsight the roads not taken seem unlikely. I think even against like really powerful forces in the past, you see in places like central Louisiana, really strong Black political mobilization, organizing around agrarian mobilization, fraternal organizations, rather educational activism as well. So I think that sort of community improvement as well is a really strong feature here, despite the unpromising surrounds there. I hope that gives some part of an answer there. And yeah, I think continuing, the fact that activism continues in spite of the many narrowed possibilities there would be something to take.
Thank you. Another question we have here is about studying American history from the perspective of a non-American scholar. How do you think that that influences your perspective or the way that you interact with this research? What alternate perspectives can you maybe bring to the project?
Thank you. I'd say in part, unlike many people who write for American university presses, I didn't go through an American university system. I think my sort of center of gravity in terms of like what I learned about the world growing up is quite different from had I grown up in Alexandria, Louisiana, or somewhere in the US. I think perhaps I'm less likely to buy into American exceptionalism. I think you do get I think you can have a good detachment here. Historically, before, not that plane tickets are cheap or anything, but before transatlantic travel was a bit easier, you suddenly had the challenge of actually getting to archives, which kind of shaped the sorts of research you could do. I think had I been based in the US throughout, it probably certainly changed like the research process. But I think I believe at least. I think I'm somewhat more detached from these things, although you do. I hope you can read and see that you can certainly become very very familiar with your subject material as a if I say an informed outsider.
Thank you. Next question that we have here is about sort of balancing the individual and the collective. So for a story like this, where you're looking at an entire parish, how did you balance sort of giving individual anecdotes about important people or their experiences with discussing the parish as a whole and talking about larger group or social issues, and sort of how did you strike that balance?
Thank you. Another excellent question. I think personally, I find individual stories really interesting. I think they help sort of hopefully they help to catch your attention and tie together a story here, but also with the collective. Again, like with the internet, with things like Ancestry.com and Family Search and all these various other collections of online sources, you can do an awful lot of sort of analyzing changes over time of like the parish. So there certainly is some of that sort of social history in there. So you're using, having said those places, one thing that I did use was looking at agricultural schedules, and you can look at how who owns land, who rents it, who's a sharecropper, and that sort of thing, and how that changes over time to try and give a sort of bigger sense of that sort of scale. One thing that I think is challenging perhaps is sort of navigating the weights of the stories, where you certainly do get like an overrepresentation of people who are really angry about congressional Reconstruction, where elite white Democrats have the loudest voices that have survived. So that is certainly challenging. But I hope an answer is like both, and I suspect just having sort of a sort of macro level, analyzing trends and, let's say, analyzing tax rolls and what have you, might make for more challenging reading. So I hope the two sort of provide something readable and ideally informative about how things change and these sort of bigger picture things in terms of like what the economic gains of African Americans after freedom looked like in this part of the South, for instance.
Thank you. In terms of future projects, are you planning on working on something similar next, something very different? What are you working on now?
Well, at the moment I'm looking at so still in Louisiana. I became really interested towards the end of this project when looking at the memories of Reconstruction violence and the memories of the Colfax massacre, particularly. I found out about this self-taught African American poet and historian called Marcus Christian, who was active in the 20th century, well, early through late in New Orleans. So I've become particularly interested in looking at around the New Deal era and African American sort of historical writing there. So that's something where I am very interested. I'd like to find out more. It's certainly early stages, but that's where I see things going, I think. That's what I'd like to do next, at least. He seems a fascinating figure.
Thank you. Our next question from the audience is from Stephanie. Question is, does this information reinforce the need for reparations?
It certainly shows that the playing field was nowhere near level at freedom, or you see a very very restricted version of what freedom is for many African Americans after slavery in this region. So you see a sort of halting moves towards that, and not universal, but extremely widespread resistance to African American economic and other gains there. I think without wading too much into that, I think with reparations, I mean, there may be a challenge with like the sort of political window of when that discussion is, but it certainly shows that there are like generational disadvantages that from Reconstruction and beyond. It's not as though these disparities or economic inequalities rose up overnight. It's something that was African American freedoms were very much contested, even for like the gains that African Americans make during Reconstruction. It's from a standing start, I'd say.
Thank you. And our last question here is about, you mentioned combining the in-person and the digital research methods for this book. How did you know when you needed to do in-person research, which obviously is a lot more difficult, time-consuming, expensive than digital research? And how did you know when a source needed to be studied in person versus digitally?
Thanks. For some of this, I guess when I started the project, I didn't necessarily think that having somebody digitize materials was necessarily viable. I think often some of the materials just aren't readily digitized. So many sort of archival collections, like maybe in the future this will happen, but at say LSU, there are many collections from there. I think it's lower or Louisiana and lower Mississippi Valley collection that you can't easily get to without going there yourself. Others, I mean, there's one benefit of people being so interested in the Civil War is that there's an awful lot available there. So you can do a great deal around service records, censuses and so on there, and that's become more and more available. I think one other really helpful thing I thought was things like Southern claims in this case, where again, like getting a window on the 1870s, sure, but also what people claimed they were doing during the Civil War there. I guess if I'd done it again, I certainly went through some of these things, asking for digitizations. Some of it's just like a policy where some archives won't, and I'm sure a challenge from doing it from a distance is that you don't necessarily. Generally, I've found archivists have been hugely helpful, with almost no exceptions. Archivists tend to know their collections best. So if you tend to be able to be around and be able to take advantage of finding out the things that you didn't know you wanted to look for, has been really really beneficial in doing these projects. So that's I guess, a partial answer. There's certainly there's a good deal that you can do from overseas. But certainly the archival stuff and the sort of the trickier to find things where sometimes it's things like you can get most newspapers, but there's without going to an archive, I wouldn't have found a few pretty obscure issues of the Rapides Gazette, for instance, or things like that would be much more difficult to find. So there is certainly a balance. I think you could do a pretty good job from a distance, but it certainly does limit the types of research you could do. Thank you for the question. I should say thank you everybody for coming. I will show off the book once more. I should say, or would like to say, if you are interested in getting a copy, you can, if you look at the link in the comments, you should be able to buy the book with a 40% discount there. So if you are interested, you may see an attempt to show a fracturing of the state. I'm very pleased with the excellent work that Press did with the cover as well. But really, thank you so much for listening today. And I hope you have a good afternoon, evening, or morning. Thank you.